I'm going to be talking about, as the chair has said, about what I'm calling here emotional and behavioural problems in children with autism, particularly focus on how those problems, mental health difficulties, develop through childhood into adulthood. Here's the outline. I'm going to just be introducing the sort of topic. I know the whole session today and next week is on mental health. I'm just going to introduce some of the key issues in understanding mental health difficulties in individuals with autism, and then tell you something from some population studies that we in the UK have been running for a number of years now. I'll introduce those studies. They're called SNAP and QUEST, about how common mental health problems in those studies are, and then be describing, we've followed up the children in our studies, in one of them, from age 12 to age 16, now to age 23 in early adulthood, talking about the profiles and indeed the predictors of mental health outcomes in young adults with autism that we've followed up from mid-childhood. Then I'm also going to be showing some brief findings from Professor Kathy Lord's studies. It's called the EDX study in the US, where she's been studying those cohorts from the age of 2 through to the age of 25, looking at some of those same issues, and then summarizing some of the broader sort of clinical implications that I hope you'll find helpful. This is just a schematic. In fact, it is from Kathy Lord, from one of her papers. It's a schematic of DSM-5, which is not new any longer. I'm a great fan of DSM-5 for a lot of reasons, but in relation to a talk on mental health, one of the things that I think DSM-5 made clear, that I think a lot of us had known for a long time, is that the important outcomes of a diagnostic assessment of autism is not just whether or not the child or young person meets diagnostic criteria for autism. That's often the reason why they're referred to a clinical service. So the DSM-5 criteria are all on the left of the screen, and you're familiar with those. On the right is just a summary of what are called in DSM-5 the clinical specifiers. And alongside of diagnosis, it's emphasized how important it is to describe different profiles of any individual and their strengths and weaknesses in regard to their language, their intellectual functioning, something about onset, whether they had regression or not, but then importantly, what are called here comorbid. I'll talk about co-occurring sort of symptoms. And that's primarily mental health conditions in young children. We often use the term emotional and behavioral problems. And then medical conditions, genetic conditions. The important thing there is that a good outcome for a diagnostic assessment is not just deciding whether the child or a young person meets the diagnostic criteria for autism, but it's also saying what their profile is, including having some assessment of their emotional and behavioral problems or profile, or in older individuals, we'd say mental health problems. And that's one of the really important instructive things that DSM-5 has encouraged us to do. And I know in the national guidance that we wrote here in the UK, that's a committee called NICE, the National Institute of Clinical and Healthcare Excellence, our diagnostic recommendations for both children and young people and for adults emphasize the same thing. A key aspect of a diagnostic assessment should be profiling, and that profiling, amongst the other things on the right of the screen, should include mental health profiling. This is a different schematic, and it's just another reminder, and we'll come on to how common mental health problems are, of all the things to think about when you think about what we know commonly occurs with autism. In medical language, we often talk about, we use the word comorbidities. I think more commonly now people are beginning to use the term co-occurring conditions, and that's partly because the community prefer the term in terms of language. The morbidity, certainly in English, because it refers to illness and death, is not a preferred term. but also it assumes less about the causal association between mental health conditions, psychiatric disorders, emotional behavioral problems, and autism. It's more agnostic. It doesn't, as to why they co-occur. It's simply describing that they're very common. And here you have both on the right-hand side, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, attention problems, hyperactivity, but then at the bottom right, a whole range of behaviors that aren't necessarily themselves psychiatric diagnoses, but are very, very common, particularly in young children, but in many individuals with autism, in terms of irritability and tantrums, self-injury, aggression. And those are all sort of problems that are very highly co-occurring in individuals with autism. This is actually a slide from Meng-Shun Lai, who I know is speaking after me this afternoon, and this is from a really nice systematic review and meta-analysis that he and colleagues conducted that was published a few years ago. This is looking at all the population studies of how common mental health diagnoses co-occur in individuals with autism. This is a combination of both childhood studies, pediatric studies, and adult studies. But just as a summary, you can see the conditions listed here are very, very common. So close to 30% from the overall meta-analytic results, close to 30% of populations of individuals with autism meet criteria for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. Around 20% in childhood, it's probably higher, I'll come on to that, meet criteria for an anxiety disorder, 10% perhaps for depressive disorder, smaller numbers for bipolar and for schizophrenia, around 10% for OCD, obsessive compulsive disorders, and then 12% or so for disruptive, impulsive, oppositional conduct disorders. Sleep disorders I'll mention later on. So the lesson from that is, these are population studies. In the same paper, Meng-Shun and his colleagues have another column, it's orange, I remember, I think in the table, which has the prevalence rates in clinical samples of individuals with autism, which are significantly higher. These are from the population studies that have been done. This is schematic from a paper that we published in January last year. Kathy Lord's the first author, a number of us contributed. And this is our summary using information from some of the cohorts I'm going to be describing in more detail today. It draws partly on data from our SNAP study, which I'll talk about, and the QUEST study, and also from Kathy's own EDX study. But it's saying on the right-hand side, these are just rough estimates of what the developmental changes from childhood to mid-childhood and adolescence to early adulthood in the prevalence of the different mental health conditions. And there you can see, as I've suggested, anxiety disorders in very young children may be as much as 50%, and ADHD as high as 40%, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder also very high. And that continues and changes into adolescence, but then in adult you get the greater emergence alongside continuing anxiety, lower rates of ADHD, but increasing levels of depression and OCD. And then on the left-hand side is just talking about some of the impacts and influences on those over time. And I'm going to be showing you today in some of the detail from some of the studies on which this summary figure was drawn for this particular paper. This is a review article from a few years ago, and it's probably the best description that I know of how the different ways in which we conceptualize the why and how and the way in which co-occurring mental health conditions may exist alongside autism. And that's that it could be an independent, true comorbidity. So the individual, for whatever reasons, happens to have autism, but alongside that, other similar but other factors have contributed, and that which has led to that individual to also have an anxiety disorder or ADHD or OCD. So that's just not necessarily random, but it's a true co-occurrence. The individual has two separate disorders that may have common roots, but they're there and they exist in the same way as they would for an individual with anxiety disorder or with ADHD or with OCD who did not have autism. The manifestations and perhaps even the causes might be the same. The second is that actually what look at the surface, because of the behavior that's observed, because of what the individuals are reporting, it may look like anxiety or ADHD, but may simply be a manifestation, a sort of alternative byproduct of having autism itself. And that what we see and looks like anxiety is really just in part a sort of extended reflection of the autistic presentation. So in that circumstance, it would be as if the person did not have that disorder at all. And then there's something that's a little bit different, which is this thing that's called, it's a complex English term, but an epiphenomenon. So a sort of an indirect sort of expression of things that come either from being autistic or the challenges that being autistic mean in terms of the way in which you're developing and your brain and behavior are developing because the challenges that autism brings. This talk is not about understanding the etiology, and certainly at the moment, one of the things that we and many other groups around the world are doing is trying to use sort of independent sources, for example, things like functional neuroimaging sort of studies and other sort of things to understand more which different parts of these three explanations, it's probably some combination of all three, are probably the best reflection of nature, but they are important to think about because it will then potentially impact on treatments, whether they're medical treatments or psychological treatments, understanding the mechanisms that lie behind the very high co-occurrence of mental health problems in individuals with autism may well have important implications for whether those treatments, for example, should be the same as the treatments that we know have some effectiveness in young people with anxiety disorders who do not have autism, or young people or children with ADHD who do not have autism. But that's not the main focus of the talk today, but it's a very important context. These are just two slides on some of the general sort of considerations. And one thing clinically is that one has to adjust the lens, the mindset that you're using as a clinician when you're thinking about assessing emotional disorders in autism. And that partly relates to the slide I've just shown. You're wanting to disentangle, is this really a manifestation of this child or young person being anxious? Or am I just seeing a manifestation of the autism that we know this young person has? And one thing would be that emotional disorders, which in typical populations who are non-autistic would usually have a more fluctuating course, may actually just be more persistent or permanent, in an individual sort of with autism. So change and fluctuation in mood and emotional states may not be present in the same way. Some of the presence of those disturbed, disruptive emotional states may be more constant. The second, an obvious point that many of you will be familiar with is don't over-rely on language. Certainly once children, are several years into school, into mid-childhood, which I would count as about 8 to 10, as well as asking their parents, one of the clear sources of information about emotional problems is what the young person says about their own experiences, their own fears and anxiety, their own responses to situations where they're uncomfortable or their behavior is difficult or challenging. Of course, you would ask the young person with autism the same questions, but you cannot rely so much on their language. Partly because some people with autism will have more limited vocabulary, more limited understanding of abstract language that we use to describe internal emotional states and responses and feelings that we describe to understand the internal workings of our own minds, which we all do in our everyday language. So thinking about using visual aids, thinking about offering choices, and other more visual ways of helping people to explain what they're experiencing is going to be important. The differentiation of emotional responses and emotional feelings, both of oneself and of other people, is diminished, impoverished in many individuals with autism. There's a term that's very popular at the moment. I find it partly helpful and partly certainly is not a term I'd use with parents very often, alexithymic. So a sort of a weakened sort of, understanding and connection, both to experience and to describe internal states and internal feelings and emotions. But that may be a problem in accessing what a young person is truly feeling if they may be feeling anxious or maybe having ruminations about things not being right or about things like contamination that may be relevant to OCD. Sometimes the triggers for emotional responses can be easily missed because they're so minor or very, very particular to that individual child. That is almost more, in English we'd say, idiosyncratic, sort of strange and unusual responses that just make people very upset. So the child who just cannot bear to hear a baby crying or whatever it might be. I've already said about not relying on language and people reporting themselves. You obviously always should be talking to parents. And lastly, that physical symptoms of emotional states, the physical feelings of tension and the physical side of worry and feeling sick may just be more evident than the way that you describe to other people when you're feeling anxious and the thoughts and ruminations that go through your mind. Then in relation to ADHD, these are different sorts of considerations. So here, that we know that one of the things that one's assessing when one's assessing whether a child would meet criteria for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder would be about how long they can attend and focus on things. Well, we know at the same time that many children and young people with autism have very highly developed, often restricted interests that they can do for very long periods of time and indeed seem to like doing for very long periods of time. You need to be looking at how they attend to a range of activities in a range of settings. That's not so different from what we look for in the diagnosis of ADHD, where you would usually expect to see it across context, at home and at school, in structured and in less structured environments. But for individuals with autism, you need to make sure that you're both sampling by observation and asking parents about a range of different activities and settings. Sometimes differentiating poor attention from poor motivation and diminished social interests. People may not respond, may not be seeming to pay attention because they're not responding to social cues, because they're not bothered when the teacher, or their aunt and uncle are calling them. Someone from the family is calling them from another room, and they're just less interested. They're less engaged. They're less attuned. Sometimes some forms of motor mannerism or stereotypy or repetitive motor movements could be mistaken for inattentive fidgeting. Differentiating impulsivity from a lack of understanding of social norms is important too. It's also, of course, the case that individuals who have both autism and ADHD can be very socially approaching, but rather socially indiscriminate. So they make social approaches indiscriminately to people whether or not that's safe, whether or not that's someone that they should, the social norms would say they should be approaching. Perhaps you should be more cautious of people in authority or people in uniforms or people who look frail. But if you have autism and you're a bit disinhibited, you will go up and speak to anyone. The combination of being socially disinhibited and not reading and not understanding the social norms certainly leads to breakdowns in social relationships with peers, and actually makes many young people with autism very socially vulnerable, and vulnerable to exploitation from others when they get into the teenage years. This is just a schematic to sort of talk about how autism and co-occurring on the left-hand side mental health problems can lead to the states that end up with very high levels of challenging behavior. And one of the things I know that many parents have said to us over the years, and I think we see this a lot in the clinic I currently work in, is that once parents are past the initial diagnostic phase, and depending on the particular presentation their child or young person has of autism, it's not managing the autism necessarily itself that's most difficult for parents, but actually managing the challenging behavior. So the combination of having autism and high levels of emotional and behavioral disturbance, high levels of mental health problems, do create these significant challenges. And certainly, as many of you clinicians will know in the audience, that certainly we find many young people with autism, they can be excluded from school, social relationships, even when they're able to form them, break down very quickly, and families and for parents, including siblings, the family home, has awfully high levels of conflict with very frequent breakdowns and tantrums and meltdowns and damage to furniture and objects and all sorts of things. Really distressing and sad things. So they're very important things to understand better, and as we'll come on to the end, to also understand how to treat. So these are the two sort of cohorts I'm describing. This is the special needs and autism population, and we've published quite a lot. This is the first population study published in 2006 in the Lancet that reported a prevalence of 1 in 100 children, 1% of children having some form of autism, which at the time seemed rather high and we were quite cautious of, but seems to have been confirmed by studies in many countries now around the world. But it's a population cohort drawn from a birth cohort, and we identified all children with a known diagnosis, all children who had any form of special educational needs identified. And then we had I'll show you a schematic in the moment. We had a particular way of screening and then doing diagnostic assessments. And the population we ended up studying in great detail was 158 children at the age of sort of 12 with autism. The diagnostic assessments I'm not talking about, but they took 2 full days, and they had very, very thorough, careful sort of diagnosis with a number of international experts blind rating some of the sample to make sure there was good agreement between international experts and our team about whether these children had autism, particularly since the prevalence turned out to be higher than we previously expected, but now confirmed. And we have data from this structured child and adolescent psychiatric interview. I'll show you the measures later on. And we use what's called an epidemiological population weighting design. So all of the data we have from the 158 children we saw in detail is weighted back to the total population within the epidemiological framework. The Quest cohort's a more recent one. We've published some papers, and there's a lot of work now going on in this cohort. So they were all children in 2 London districts who received a diagnosis by the age of 4, deliberately, this time, changing tack and focusing on children who got an early diagnosis, wanting to see what happened to them over their development into adulthood. And we managed to see 70% of the children from the 2 districts who were given a diagnosis by the age of 4. That's 277 children who were seen in detail at the age of 5 to 9. I haven't got longitudinal data on that, but we've subsequently seen them at age 13 and just recently at age 17. So we're also following that cohort, we hope, into adulthood as well. And we have a similar assessment of the ADI, the ADOS, IQ, adaptive behaviour, and in this case, in early childhood, the preschool and primary psychiatric assessment. We also oversampled this population for girls to make sure we had enough to look at sex differences. So these are from the 2 cohorts. Blue is the 12-year-old SNAP, and green is the 5 to 9-year-olds Quest. And these are just the rates of any mental health condition. So on the left, any mental health condition is 70% of the 12-year-olds met criteria for a mental health condition at the age of 12 in the SNAP sample. And then nearly 90% of children in the Quest cohort met criteria for any emotional and behavioural disorder at that point. We tend not to call them mental health or psychiatric disorders in 5 to 9-year-olds, but essentially that's what the instrument is doing. That's probably, it's a minor point. We think that instrument, the PAPA, slightly inflates that figure, but clearly in both cohorts, the vast majority of individuals with autism in these different population samples have a mental health problem, both at 12 and earlier on at 5 to 9. Emotional and behavioural problems in these are the highest. Combining emotional and behavioural problems is 60% in the SNAP cohort and over 80% in Quest. And we've just put one version of what the typical non-autistic population prevalences of emotional and behavioural problems would be. And that's something like 10% are in 12-year-olds and maybe as high as 15% in 5 to 9-year-olds. But you can see 4 or 5 times higher in the autistic population than in the typical population. This is again using data from the Meng Shun Lai systematic review and meta-analysis. That's the population rates from Meng Shun's paper in yellow. The clinical samples, I said, were high in Meng Shun's paper in red. And here again for us, blue is the SNAP sample, the 12-year-olds, green is Quest, the 5 to 9-year-olds. And here you can see that both across the meta-analysis that Meng Shun and colleagues have done, and across our samples, the rates again of ADHD and anxiety are very, very high. On the right, disruptive behavioural problems, oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder are also high in most of those samples. Depression, at least in these studies, and the meta-analysis less so. And then the less common disorders, bipolar disorder, psychosis, OCD. This is within, on the left, the SNAP sample, the 12-year-olds, on the right, the Quest sample, the 5 to 9-year-olds, just showing the co-occurrence, the overlap between the different conditions. The highest overlap, as we'd expect, is between disruptive behavioural disorders, ODD and conduct disorder, and ADHD. We know that from the typical population, but there's also high co-occurrence between emotional problems and behavioural problems and emotional problems and ADHD. And those rates of co-occurrence are higher than in the general population. And they're there in different profiles, both in young childhood at 5 to 9 and by the age of 12. We will have data on the SNAP sample from the adult 23-year psychiatric assessment. We've just not finished analysing that data yet, but we're looking at that currently, right now. Just to say the other disorders that I haven't sort of shown you, but they are important because clinically they're very significant. And again, they're important potentially for treatment, is the presence of tics that's very high in both samples, 10% in the 12-year-olds, more than 15% in the 5 to 9-year-olds. That's probably rather inflated. But then enuresis and encopresis are also, as you would expect, quite common. This is just showing you the longitudinal study in SNAP. This is the population cohort where we found 1 in 100 12-year-olds had some form of autism. So the sample is actually nearly 57,000 children. So it's quite a large, it's a fairly large sort of population. This just says, I'm not going to go into the detail, but the particular screening that we did and who we saw for different in-depth assessments. But essentially in the middle of the screen, you can see that we saw these individuals at the age of 12. And that's the 158 we focus on. We then saw a subsample with IQs who were higher for a cognitive study at 16, and that was about 2/3 of them. A third of them we didn't see, but then we saw as many of the 158, and we saw about 80%, 126, a few years ago at the age of 20, the age of 23. So this is the longitudinal study where I'm going to be showing you some data about what happens to mental health conditions from 12 to 16 to 23. This is just a summary, and I don't have time to walk you through it. Many of you will be familiar with these clinical instruments. These are the domains on the left, the first row: autism measures, IQ and cognitive ability measures, adaptive behavior measures, and measures of mental health or psychopathology. We have the SDQ, the same instrument at all 3 time points, and then we have different instruments at different time points. So this is a paper that came out last year from the SNAP cohort. So it's looking at the trajectories of emotional and behavioral problems from 12 years to 23 years of age. This is one of the few population longitudinal studies that's been sort of done. This is a particular, it's a diagram of quite a fancy structural equational sort of modeling. The technicalities don't matter in detail, but what this allows us to do is to take the different measures, and here, I'm sorry, it's rather small, you know, takes the measures in the 3 domains: conduct problems, emotional problems, ADHD problems. And then we have the 3 time points, 12, 16, and 23. This is all using the SDQ for this analysis. And then we have a parent report of those behaviors at each time point. But we also, at 12 and 16, for some participants, have teacher report, and we include all of those things in one structural equation model. And we look at essentially things that predict the intercept, how common these things are at 12, and things that predict growth from 12 to 16 to 23. We also have things like parental mental health variables, which I'll mention through some of the work I'm reporting. We're interested in the interaction between the young person's mental health over time and potentially the impact in both directions of the mental health and well-being of the parent. These are the 3 summary slides. So on the top left, this is conduct problems, on the top right, emotional problems, and on the bottom left, ADHD sort of symptoms. What you can see, it's clearer really for the individuals than the thick black lines that we've written across this, but the trend essentially is downwards. So, you know, from the age of 12 through to the age of 23, across the sample within this model, at a group level, the absolute levels on this measure, the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, of conduct problems, emotional problems, and ADHD symptoms decreases over time. Then we looked at what predicts that decrease, and we found most of the prediction could be explained for the conduct problems and the decrease in conduct problems essentially by ability and adaptive behavior. So conduct problems decrease over time more in individuals who are more able, and they decrease less so remain higher in individuals who are less able, who have lower language competence, and who have worse everyday adaptive function. We also found that there were associations between some aspects of social economic circumstances and conduct problems over time, although not quite in the direction we would have expected. We actually found very few other predictors of that decline sort of over time in any of those three sort of areas, which we perhaps sort of weren't expecting. But what it means is that although as on the whole, the levels go down, many individuals over time by early adulthood are still showing high levels of problem. We've also looked here, and this is work by a postdoc who's a clinician in the service with Emily Simonoff and myself at the at King's in London, and Matt Hollicks, and we also looked at life events. So we used a fairly standard measure, looking at significant illness, the death of a close relative, witnessing or experiencing trauma, violent crime, contact with police, unemployment, financial struggles, breakdowns in relationships, significant breakdowns. So we're able here to look at the changes in different domains, here on the left, emotional problems, and on the right, conduct problems, and whether or not people had, going from left to right on each graph, you know, a low level of significant negative life events, a medium level, or high exposure, or high level. And you can see here, both for conduct problems and for emotional problems, there's clearly an interaction between age 16 and age 23 in what's happening to the individual and the levels of emotional and conduct problems they're showing at 23. So one of the important lessons for this is, you know, that these are not fully inbuilt to the individual. Their life experiences are affecting their mental health in early adulthood, and helping us understand and think about what that tells us about things that make people more or less vulnerable through adolescence to having worse mental health outcomes in adulthood. Again, it's a sort of it's quite a clever structural equation model that Matt's been doing. These last few slides are new, unpublished sort of data. So please don't take photographs and share them. But again, here we're looking at how life events, you know, relate to emotional problems and conduct problems. I've described the sort of, you know, the overall pattern where life events do impact between adolescents, 16 and 23, on the levels of both emotional and conduct problems. And this is shown within the model here. What this also shows is actually just to show you the strength of the associations over time, that actually these are quite high cross-time correlations between 12, 16 and 23 on emotional problems score and conduct problems score. What's not shown here is that these life events also negatively impact on parental mental health over time. So what we're finding, again, it's not shown, but we're also finding that parental mental health across this same time period from 16 to 23 also is associated with mental health in the young adult with autism. So what that's sort of showing is that there are, you know, life experiences and events that interact with mental health and well-being. And that's true for the young person who's growing into adulthood with autism, and for their parents, and those different things interact. I'll just show you this slide briefly. This is just another thing that Matt's been doing, using a different way of modeling, where we look at, this is looking at cognitive flexibility. These are neuropsychological tests at 16. We're asking, do they predict outcomes like anxiety and depression in adulthood? And the answer is yes, they do. So this is a summary from SNAP. Emotional and behavioural problems, they reduce over time, but they remain in the cohort quite high. We're going to be reporting on psychiatric diagnoses, which I haven't talked about so much in the adult sample at all today. Adverse life events affect mental health of young people growing into adulthood, and also parental mental health. And cognition may be important as well. So this is the Kathy Lord EDX study. So say it's this relatively small sample of 123 individuals, but they were seen from the age of 2, and they were seen at 2 and 3 and 5 and 9 and 17, and they've been seen between about 23 and 25. So it's a very, very valuable sample of children who are ascertained at a very young sort of age. Here's one of the sort of papers by Kathy and Jim, one of her sort of postdocs. And this is using different measures than we've been using, but showing you similar things. So on the top, it's attention problems. Then on the bottom left, anxiety and mood disorders. That's the more anxiety disorders, and then more depression, mood disorders. And here they're looking at trajectories. And what they do is what's called a latent class analysis, to group them into classes to see whether individuals fall over time into 2 groups. And what they find for each of the areas of problems, attention problems, anxiety problems, mood, depression problems, there's always 2 groups. One have relatively low levels of problems that decline or stay stable, and one have much higher levels. But the trajectory here changes. So attention problems are decreasing the most into adulthood. We know that ADHD to some extent is outgrown hardly by many individuals, at least some manifestations are. Anxiety in the group with high problems stays high. And then depression peaks somewhat in early adulthood around the 19-year assessment, and then perhaps begins to go down, but it's quite a small sample. Then there's a way of looking at how many individuals in the sample fall into these high levels of problem. So just to sort of say, go back, so these are T-scores. So the clinicians will know T-score above 70 is definitely clinically significant. So these are the group averages. You can see that T-scores of 65 or 70 are really in the clinical range. So the high groups here are very high clinical levels of severity in mental health problems. And 63% of the autism sample from Kathy's EDX study fall into at least one high trajectory, and 1/3 of them, 29%, are in 2 or all 3 classes in terms of the co-occurrence of high levels of mental health problems in adulthood. This is a bit of a hard slide to read. It's one of my favorite slides. This has just come out online. It's a reanalysis by a colleague who works with us, Andrew Pickles, but also with Kathy. Here we're looking at different ways, and you can, what proportion, on the left-hand side here, what proportion of outcomes in hyperactivity or irritability or behavioral problems can you predict at what age? That's the question here. And then here we have positive and negative anxiety symptoms and depression. Well, the story is actually you can't predict very much before preschool. So this is looking at the adult 20 to 25-year outcomes in EDX, in Kathy's sample, and what can you predict from earlier time points? And you don't predict anything in terms of mental health problems before preschool, before 5 years. You can predict some of these things, hyperactivity and irritability, but not brilliantly, but a little bit from about the age of 9. But you can't predict adult affective and mood disorders at all from childhood or adolescence, which is really remarkable. It's one of those findings that's rare. These are very, very flat, and the levels of prediction, certainly for mood and affective disorders, are almost non-existent. For externalizing disorders, they're somewhat higher, but they're only moderate, but they're non-existent here, which is a challenge. we'd like to know which individuals with autism as they grow up are most vulnerable to emotional and mood problems. And it's not clear that we can say that beyond the fact that individuals who have higher levels early on tend to have higher levels later on. I'll just, yeah, let's like forward back. So now I'm sort of coming to the sort of close a little bit. I mean, this is just, you know, this is not supposed to be a talk of doom and gloom, you know, because it's not the focus of the talk today in terms of treatments, but there's been a lot of work in the past 10 years, a lot of good work in the past 10 years in terms of treating mental health conditions in children and young people with autism. I should say there's been far less work in work with adults, and that's work that's beginning to be done, but much more is needed about treating mental health conditions in adults. But I'm showing you examples I know best from the childhood literature. Here is a meta-analysis, and it's done very well. It's from a few years ago. I think it's from 2018. This is CBT, often modified, but CBT for anxiety disorders. Some is individuals, some is groups, some's with the young person, some also have groups with parents, but they put it all together. There's parental involvement at the top without parental involvement at the bottom. And these are what are called forest plots. These are clever ways of showing lots of different trial data all in one graph. Some of us like to look at these. The things you should be looking at are these diamonds here. This is the summary of parental involvement, and that's an effect size of about 0.6, and that's an effect size of about 0.35. So essentially, this is saying across all the trials that have been done of CBT, often modified, for anxiety disorder in children and young people with autism, is treatment effective? At a group level, yes, it is. And then this is just an individual study from Larry Scahill's group from a few years ago now in sort of JAMA. I like this because of the clarity. So this is a very nice study because this is individualized parent behavioral training to manage behavioral problems, disruptive, irritable, behavioral, challenging behavior. And it's a study where they don't compare their treatment, their individualized parent training, to a treatment as usual, i.e. a wait list to get nothing, but they compare it to a general parental education on the same topic. So it's a hard test. Parent training has a significant effect across the program that lasts for 16 to 24 weeks. So those are really quite large differences between the groups. And here's a systematic review and meta-analysis that we did on all the parenting interventions that have been done for young children with autism. Some of these are individual, some of these are group, they're a mixture. And again, the diamond at the bottom on the right-hand side, it's an effect size from memory. It's about 0.65, which is quite high for trials. So this was done a couple of years ago now, but you can see there are 10 studies, almost all showing benefit because they cross the line on the right-hand side, and overall there's a clear effect. Although I've spoken quite a lot about how enduring mental health problems can be for young people with autism, and how we're not very good always at predicting why they may maintain. We know some of the factors. It is important to remember that there are things that can be done. So to conclude, I started off by saying that co-occurring mental health problems are the norm and not the exception in individuals with autism. In any mental health service, in fact, in any diagnostic or clinical service, they should always be assessed and considered, because you will find them more often than you don't. DSM-5 and indeed ICD-10 less forcefully, but essentially says you must assess the clinical profile alongside the diagnosis. Many individuals have multiple mental health problems. Problems start from early on in the preschool years, and they endure over time. Some of the presentations are atypical, and we need to account for the differences. And we know that both things within the individual and their family and their parental mental health, and some aspects of their background, although less so in the general population, like social deprivation, but things like life events, things that happens to the individual, and we only started measuring those from 16 onwards, so we didn't measure early childhood life events, have an impact both on the adult with autism mental health and on the parental mental health, and the two interact. So there are events that happen that make the outcomes worse. And then I've not covered medication, I'm a psychologist, but there's an increasing evidence base, certainly for irritability and anxiety, and an increasingly common use, with cautions. We certainly need to know, all the things around safety and efficacy and tolerability, but also we need to know more about medications in adulthood from better trials. Psychological interventions, both for behavioural problems and anxiety, are building quite strong evidence bases now. We certainly need, a lot of the focus has been on young children, and we need to know much more about adolescence, later adolescence and adulthood, and do more trials with people of that age. And many autism-specific adaptations, are beginning to be, widely, used and taught, and that's a very good thing. So, thank you very much, Gracias. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.